Thanks to YouGov for sponsoring this video. I'm Mr. Beat. On January 30th, 1835, a dude who spent most of his free time painting houses decided he was going to become the first known person in history to attempt to assassinate the President of the United States. This dude's name was Richard Lawrence, and he possibly suffered from a mental disorder called schizophrenia. He often would wander around, having meaningless conversations with himself. On the morning of Friday, January 30th, 1835, he sat in his paint shop with a book in his hand, laughing hysterically. Then, all of a sudden, Lawrence jumped up and said, quote, "I'll be damned if I don't do it." He went to the U.S. Capitol, to the funeral of a U.S. representative from South Carolina named Warren Davis. He went there to shoot the president. At the end of the funeral, he found a space near one of the Capitol's pillars and waited for the president to pass. Finally, the president came, and as he walked by, Lawrence stepped out and fired his pistol at the president's back. The first bullet misfired. He quickly attempted another shot with his second pistol, but it also misfired. By this time, the 67-year-old president had begun attempting to beat the crap out of Lawrence with his walking cane. Davy Crockett, who was a U.S. representative of Tennessee at the time, and who would die just over a year after this event at the Battle of the Alamo, tackled Lawrence to the ground. The president kept trying to beat Lawrence with his cane, but others pulled him back. That president was Andrew Jackson. The likelihood of both guns misfiring, by the way, was 125,000 to 1. Here's the story of one of the luckiest, but also one of the toughest and most terrifying presidents in American history. But first, I'm going to tell you about YouGov. YouGov is my favorite way to take surveys while earning extra cash and rewards. I think I originally started using it when I was stuck in line somewhere, maybe the DMV, but I kept doing it because it's an easy way to answer questions and be heard while getting rewarded for it. Often, I take YouGov surveys on the toilet. That reminds me, I probably need to clean my phone. Anyway, YouGov is free to join and an easy way to get extra cash. Hey, you can make it a side hustle too. Tap my link in the description of this video to start taking surveys and make extra cash. Thanks to YouGov for sponsoring this video. Andrew Jackson was born in the Waxhaws, a region near the present-day border of northern South Carolina and southern North Carolina. Boy, that's a bit confusing. On March 15th, 1767. Andrew's parents, Elizabeth and Andrew Jackson Sr., were Ulster Scots who had moved from Pennsylvania to the Carolinas 2 years prior. Yeah, they may have squatted on land when they got there. Sadly, though, Andrew never knew his dad, who died in a logging accident 3 weeks before he was born. Andrew was the youngest of 3 children, having 2 older brothers, Hugh and Robert. After the death of their father, Elizabeth moved the family in with her sister Jane Crawford and her husband and family. Elizabeth not only raised Andrew and his brothers, but also took care of Andrew's cousins, Jane's 8 children. To Andrew, his mother was kind of a superhero. Andrew's family were members of the Presbyterian Church. Elizabeth wanted Andrew to be a minister and scrounged up enough money for him to learn Latin and Greek. However, she soon realized that he wasn't fit to be a minister due to his short temper and general rebelliousness. Is that a word? Rebelliousness? And when I say Elizabeth scrounged up money, I mean she really scrounged up money. The family was poor, as you might have assumed. Andrew often got into fights with other boys growing up. He often lost fights, but always got right back up and continued to fight. Andrew didn't get much formal schooling. He was never really that good at writing or spelling. After the American War of Independence broke out, the Jacksons were definitely on the side of the rebels, aka the Patriots, especially after some Tories, aka the Loyalists, constantly came through the Waxhaws and terrorized residents there, burning down farms. After the Battle of Stono Ferry on June 20th, 1779, Andrew's brother Hugh died of heat stroke. The next year, at the age of just 13, Andrew joined his other brother, Robert, and began riding with the rebels, mostly as scouts but also delivering messages. On April 10th, 10th, 1781, British soldiers took over the Jacksons' home, destroying practically everything of value the family had. While there, they also captured Andrew and Robert. After a British officer demanded that Andrew clean his muddy boots, Andrew angrily refused. So the officer struck him on the head and hand with his sword. Supposedly, Andrew dared the officer to strike him again. The officer didn't, but the sword had already done quite a bit of damage. Andrew would have scars on his left hand and head for the rest of his life. After this, British soldiers took Andrew and Robert to a prison camp 40 miles away where they both contracted smallpox.
He's the only U.S. president ever to be a POW.
Elizabeth made the journey to rescue them. She worked out a deal to get her boys released. Sadly, by that time, the boys were extremely sick and malnourished. They barely made the journey home, with Andrew walking barefoot and without a coat the entire way. Robert died 2 days after they got home. However, as you probably already know by this point, Andrew survived the smallpox, mostly due to Elizabeth nursing him back to health. Shortly after this, Elizabeth left Andrew alone as she traveled to Charleston to aid the Patriot War effort by nursing sick and injured soldiers. While there, she got cholera and died shortly after that. Before his 15th birthday, Andrew Jackson had lost both his parents and both his brothers. Due to his experiences during the American War of Independence, he would hate anything British or anything even remotely associated with the British for the rest of his life. Not only was Andrew an orphan, he was also penniless. He lived with his uncle for a while, but soon got news from Ireland that, now his grandpa had died. His grandpa left Andrew a small inheritance, which he traveled to Charleston to pick up. However, while there, he immediately spent it all, apparently gambling most of it away. He returned to the Waxhaws and went back to school and began teaching reading and writing to elementary school-aged kids. Well, he didn't like being a teacher so much, and at the age of 17, decided he wanted to become a lawyer instead and head west. Now, in 1784, it was really freaking easy to become a lawyer compared to today, especially on the frontier. Jackson studied to become one in Salisbury, North Carolina. While there, he gained a reputation as a wild dude who partied hard, gambled a lot, got into a lot of fights, and even though it was the style back then, refused to wear a powdered wig, dadgummit. One time he threw a bunch of random furniture in a fire inside a building. That must have been a really crazy party. After Jackson officially became a lawyer in September 1787, he had a hard time finding clients and making money. However, that would soon change when his friend John McNary hooked him up with an opportunity west of the Appalachian Mountains in a tiny frontier town called Nashville. Back then, Nashville was part of western North Carolina, but today it's in the state of Tennessee. On the way there, Jackson stayed in the town of Jonesboro. This is where he got into his first duel with another lawyer named Waitstill Avery. Jackson challenged him to a duel after Avery supposedly talked trash about him. The duel ended with both men firing their guns in the air. They shook hands and became friends afterward. It was also in Jonesboro that Jackson got his first slave, who apparently was a woman his age? Ugh. That said, him getting the slave happened kind of accidentally. You see, Jackson had provided legal services to a client in Jonesboro, but the client didn't have enough cash to pay him, so he gave one of his slaves to Jackson instead. Jackson also narrowly escaped being attacked by American Indians on his way to Nashville. Future American Indian attacks in Tennessee were sometimes gruesome, and this greatly shaped Jackson's perception of American Indians. Andrew moved out here to Nashville in 1788 to become a solicitor or chief law officer. At the time, Nashville only had like a couple hundred people, and Jackson quickly made a name for himself in town, especially after gaining the attention of William Blount, a founding father dude and one of the most powerful people in North Carolina. Jackson gained a reputation as a confident and ambitious man, someone who looked you in the eyes when he talked to you, someone who spoke softly and slowly, and someone with a calm and gentle demeanor. Unless you made him angry, that is. In those early early months in Nashville, he stayed in a boarding house owned by Rachel Stockley Donaldson. Her husband, the late John Donaldson, had helped found Nashville. In fact, while there, Andrew met her daughter Rachel Donaldson Robards. Rachel Robards was married to Lewis Robards, a land speculator, but Lewis was abusive, and by 1789, the two had separated. Around that time, Andrew and Rachel fell in love and soon moved in with each other. Even though Rachel was still technically married to Lewis, the two even went off to Natchez, Mississippi to illegally get married. Lewis found out about all this and talked trash about Jackson, and so naturally Jackson challenged Lewis to a duel. Lewis refused and moved to Kentucky. Robards only later finally granted a divorce to Rachel on the basis of Rachel's, quote, infidelity. Meanwhile, William Blount, by now the governor of the Southwest Territory, had appointed Jackson to be attorney of the Miro District. Jackson also took on other clients and also became a merchant. He made enough money where he started buying up a ton of land. Tens of thousands of acres of land, to be precise. Okay. Most of that land was bought on credit. Still, the Jacksons gained a lot of wealth through land investments. Yeah, they had another absolutely horrible way of acquiring wealth. Slaves. Freaking slaves. In 1796, Andrew and Rachel got 2 more slaves as part of a settlement related to Rachel's dad's estate. For the rest of the 1790s, they bought 12 more. Jackson never said slavery was good, but he never said it was bad either. He kind of just went with the times and never really thought about it too deeply, unfortunately. Also in 1796, a pivotal moment in which Jackson was chosen to attend a convention that would lead to Tennessee becoming a state. Jackson played a big role drafting a constitution for Tennessee. He was not known as a good speaker, but he still was incredibly persuasive at the convention. Believe it or not, Jackson was a big reason why Tennessee became the name of the state. While other delegates favored naming the state after a person, he insisted the state get an American Indian name. Also in 1796, Andrew bought a square mile of land near Nashville he called Hunter's Hill. There he built a home for Rachel and him where they'd live for the next several years. When he finally got into politics, Jackson sided with the Democratic Republicans and Jefferson. It helped that he still hated Britain and was angry about the Jay Treaty, a deal created by Alexander Hamilton that led to peaceful trade with the country for 10 years. And as it turns out, most of the locals wanted Jackson in politics. On December 4th, 1796, at the age of 29, he became Tennessee's first congressman. It took 42 days for his first trip to Philadelphia, the country's capital at the time. There he immediately stood out as someone that was kind of a rebel with no filter. He seemed to be the most outspoken critic of the beloved George Washington. That said, Jackson hated being in Congress. On March 4th, 1797, Jackson abruptly left the House of Representatives to return home. However, after William Blount and others talked him into it, just a few months later, Jackson ran for and got elected U.S. Senator. Jackson tried, he really did, but he again just hated being in Congress. Not only that, Thomas Jefferson called him too emotional and said he had too much of a temper. He ultimately only lasted just over 6 months in the Senate, again, abruptly quitting. I guess he just wasn't cut out for making laws. That said, soon after he returned to Nashville, he got elected as a justice of the Tennessee Supreme Court. Still, Jackson was unhappy, and he really wasn't that good at being a judge. Instead, he increasingly longed to be a military man, even though Rachel certainly didn't want him off fighting wars. Oh, he'd fight wars all right. But first, he'd have to fight a person who had become his arch enemy, John Sevier, the governor of Tennessee. It all started after Sevier wouldn't let Jackson become major general of the state militia. Later, Sevier also talked trash about Jackson, once referring to him as a, quote, poor, pitiful, pettifogging lawyer, and another time accusing him of adultery in his marriage to Rachel. Naturally, Jackson challenged challenged Sevier to a duel. Let me repeat that for you. He challenged the governor of Tennessee to a duel. They met to duel on October 1st, 1803. After Sevier fell off his horse and broke his sword, Jackson called it good enough, and the two became friends for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, Jackson had found a way to command the Tennessee militia anyway by that time. Oh, and hey, speaking of duels, after the Vice President of the United States, Aaron Burr, infamously killed the aforementioned Alexander Hamilton in a duel a few months later, Burr became a fugitive and fled west. And guess where Burr stopped by? Andrew Jackson's house, of course. They were friends. Jackson fed him and lodged him soon after Burr killed Hamilton. And the two even talked about taking over Spanish land, especially Florida. That said, Jackson was apparently shocked to learn that Burr may have been trying to secede parts of the West from the United States. In 1804, Jackson bought a 425-acre farm that included a bunch of enslaved people. He called it the Hermitage. It's where I'm at right now, as a matter of fact. But actually, the mansion was built much later. Over the next 17 years, Andrew and Rachel actually lived in this much more modest log cabin. Over the years, they would expand the complex as they acquired more wealth, and despite living in this small cabin, they still had 9 slaves at the time. Over his lifetime, Jackson would own a total of around 300 slaves. 1804 was also the year Jackson stopped being a judge and really got into betting on horse races. There were several times in Jackson's life where he should have died, but he didn't. Notably, that time he got in a duel with a dude named Charles Dickinson. Dickinson talked trash about Rachel, but actually it may have just been miscommunication. Well, Dickinson did accuse Andrew of cheating at a horse racing bet. Regardless, another duel, here we go. Another guy involved, Thomas Swan, apparently wasn't even worthy enough to Jackson for a duel, and he just beat him with a cane instead. Anyway, back to Charles Dickinson. Jackson and Dickinson met on May 30th, 1806. This time, though, both aimed at each other. Jackson's bullet hit Dickinson in the abdomen, and Dickinson would soon die from the injury. Dickinson's bullet missed Jackson's heart by little more than an inch. The bullet actually shattered itself against Jackson's breastbone and rib cage, but it did not threaten infection. While Jackson recovered from the injury, his doctor decided to leave the bullet in his chest, since removing it might risk Jackson bleeding to death. He'd suffer from chronic pain from the bullet for the rest of his life, which, yep, stayed in his chest for the rest of his life. Jackson killing Dickinson was technically illegal at the time, but he still got away with it and was never even charged with murder. I mean, it did hurt his reputation quite a bit, but remember, duels were much more common back then. Some historians estimate Jackson was involved in as many as 100 duels throughout his life. In 1807, Jackson testified before a grand jury at Aaron Burr's trial after Burr was charged with treason. Jackson's testimony was pivotal in helping Burr get cleared of all the charges. In December 1808, Andrew and Rachel adopted one of the infant sons of Rachel's brother, Severn. Though we don't know for sure, it's possible that Andrew was sterile, possibly due to getting smallpox as a kid, which is why Rachel and him never had any kids of their own. They named him Andrew Jackson Jr., and Andrew Sr. was a pretty devoted father. To be honest, Jackson kind of spoiled his adopted son. By 1810, Andrew Jackson was probably one of the most famous men out of Tennessee, but few folks knew about him outside of the state. That most definitely changed over the next few years. In early 1812, Jackson was 44 years old and still Major General of the Tennessee Militia. By that time, it seemed inevitable that the United States would be going to war with Great Britain again. Jackson, as you might suspect by this point in the video, was one of the earliest supporters of going to war with Britain. The most war hockey of the warhawks, you could say. In fact, he tried to get a head start before Congress even declared war, attempting to gather 50,000 volunteer soldiers to prepare for an invasion of Canada. Once Congress did declare war on Britain, Jackson immediately offered the services of his militia. When the federal government finally accepted his offer, they They sent him and his soldiers to fight against the Creek Indians, a nation allied with the British. Jackson and his troops didn't see a whole lot of action, and by March 1813, they were back in Nashville. By this point, his troops were fondly calling him Old Hickory, for not only his determined attitude, but also his willingness to suffer alongside his soldiers.
Of course, we're at the Hermitage, home of Old Hickory, that's in the town of Old Hickory, near the town of Hermitage, on Old Hickory Boulevard. So Old Hickory's sort of all over the place in this area.
Indeed, his troops generally loved him. Thomas Hart Benton, the future senator, became Jackson's aide. The two got along great. That is, until Benton's brother, Jesse Benton, got into a duel with Jackson's Inspector General and future Tennessee Governor, William Carroll. In that duel, Carroll asked Jackson to serve as his second. Jackson hesitated, worried that he would upset Thomas, but ultimately supported his friend William. In the duel, Carroll shot Jesse Benton in the butt, and this frankly embarrassed Thomas. After this, Jackson and Thomas Hart Benton indeed had a falling out after Benton publicly talked trash. This enraged Jackson. On September 4th, 1813, Jackson and some friends bumped into both Thomas and Jesse Benton in the lobby of the City Hotel in Nashville. Cracking a riding whip, Jackson yelled, quote, "I am going to punish you! Defend yourself!" Well, long story short, they all ended up getting in a gunfight, and Jackson got shot twice, losing a lot of blood. Nobody died, but Jackson almost did. One of the bullets had shattered his left shoulder. His doctor wanted to amputate his arm, but Jackson wouldn't let him. Because of this, the doctor recommended that, once again, the bullet should stay put. Jackson was bedridden for almost a month while he recovered. Oh, and he and Thomas Hart Benton settled their differences and became friends again. Meanwhile, what became known as the War of 1812 was still raging, even though it was soon now 1814. Even though his shoulder was still bothering him, Jackson led his troops to a decisive victory against the Creeks in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend on March 27, 1814. By that time, Andrew and Rachel had adopted 2, maybe 3 more kids, all Creek. One was a boy they named Lincoya. They also took in another orphan boy they named Theodore, but he died soon after arriving at the Hermitage. Apparently, a third Creek child, given the name Charlie, also stayed at the Hermitage for a bit with the Jacksons. All had Creek parents who had died during the war. Jackson probably had a soft spot for orphans, since he was an orphan himself. By August 1814, Jackson had moved his troops to Mobile, not so secretly hoping he could kind of just take over Spanish Florida and claim it for the United States. He justified this potential takeover by arguing that Britain and Spain were allies, but most at the time thought the idea was a bit crazy. Jackson indeed invaded Florida on November 7th, defeating both Spanish and British forces at what became known as the Battle of Pensacola. However, soon after this, Jackson learned that the British were planning a major attack on New Orleans, a strategically important city seen as the gateway to the lower Mississippi River and its tributaries. He got to New Orleans on December 1st, 1814, finding the city unable to defend itself. His left arm was still mostly useless. He needed help to write and couldn't even feed himself properly. He was probably skinnier at this time than at any point in his life up to that point, likely due to parasites. He treated his constant severe pain by drinking alcohol. We later found out that Andrew had lots of lead in his bloodstream at this time. Still, New Orleans is where his legendary status pretty much began. He quickly took charge of the Louisiana militia. Worried about the loyalty of the city's Creole and Spanish residents, he instituted martial law. He quickly got busy recruiting and raising a force to defend the city from the British, even forming an alliance with a powerful local gang. He famously put together an untrained ragtag bunch, which included free blacks, New Orleans aristocrats, and members of the Choctaw Nation. His troops were so diverse that orders had to be given in English, French, Spanish, and Choctaw. Not only that, he paid non-white recruits the same salary as whites. About a month later, he had a force of 5,000 dedicated men. When the British finally arrived, the War of 1812 was over. But no one in New Orleans knew that. On January 8th, 1815, 15 days after a peace treaty was signed between the United States and Britain, Jackson's forces clashed with British forces just to the east of New Orleans in the most famous battle of the war, the Battle of New Orleans. Despite the British having superior forces and technology, the Americans pulled off a huge upset victory. They had just 71 casualties. The British, more than 2,000. The victory dramatically raised Jackson's national profile. Jackson immediately became a war hero. Well, not to the Creeks, who would never get their land back.
Through his military victories, particularly in regard to the Battle of New Orleans, not only changes his fortune, but more importantly, America had arrived.
Jackson returned here to the Hermitage after the war was over, but now everyone seemed to want his help. The Madison administration put Jackson in command of all troops in the southern half of the country, for crying out loud. But at least Jackson could command them from the Hermitage, which Rachel appreciated. Over the next few years, Jackson spent much of his time screwing over American Indians. He signed 5 different treaties, which all collectively took away tens of millions of acres of land from the Creek, Choctaw, Cherokee, and Chickasaw. This all tended to make the U.S. Secretary of War at the time, William Crawford, angry, you could say, since he had been dedicated to helping American Indians keep their land. Soon Jackson and Crawford were enemies. Jackson truly believed that separation between whites and American Indians offered the only chance of Indian survival. By 1817, all eyes were once again on Florida. In December, the new U.S. Secretary of War, John Calhoun, ordered Jackson to lead a campaign to fight a group of American Indians collectively known as the Seminoles. The Seminoles were attacking settlers along the border between Georgia and Spanish Florida. Though Rachel objected, Andrew accepted the order, and thus began the First Seminole War. Now, keep in mind that President James Monroe wanted Jackson just to defend Georgia. Well, Jackson interpreted that as taking over all of Florida and seizing it from Spain. Jackson and his forces invaded Florida and fairly easily defeated both Seminole and Spanish forces there. This apparently made Calhoun angry, as he tried to have Jackson censured for going against the Constitution since Congress hadn't declared war on Spain. A censure is just a formal disapproval. This move also turned Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, against Jackson. Regardless, Jackson never got in trouble, and the United States ended up buying Florida from Spain anyway. After that war, Jackson went home yet again. In 1819, Jackson began construction on the original Hermitage Mansion, which you see behind me now. It took 2 years to complete. It became Jackson's place of refuge. And when he returned from Florida, he had no desire to leave it ever again. Besides, by then, Jackson's health was in decline. His pain had gotten so bad, he could barely get around. By 1820, Jackson owned at least 48 slaves here at the Hermitage. One time, one of them ran away, and Jackson said that whoever found them could lash them as an extra reward. Jeez, dude. Still, around that time, the United States had experienced its first big economic depression, and Jackson lost a lot of money after he couldn't sell his cotton. The federal government was even forced to reduce its military and forced Jackson to retire from his major general position. When people began to meet up with him and send him messages requesting that he run for president, Jackson had absolutely no desire to. After all, he didn't expect to live much longer. Heck, he felt lucky he had reached the age of 54. But there was soon a huge grassroots effort to get him to run in 1824, and it was hard for Jackson to ignore it. This grassroots movement frankly freaked the Washington, D.C. elites out, which maybe also motivated Jackson to run. In 1823, Tennessee put Jackson back in the U.S. Senate, even though he had previously turned down running for governor. Eventually, enough people talked him into running for president in 1824. I have a video about this election that you can check out later if you want, but just know that this was one of the craziest presidential elections in American history. It ended up being a four-way race between Jackson, the Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, and the aforementioned William Crawford and Henry Clay. Jackson had a cult-like following. His supporters passionately campaigned for him, portraying him as an outsider to DC politics. Many of them were brand new to politics. Jackson didn't even have to campaign.
When Jackson ran, in many, if not most places, you had to own property to vote. You could have been there 20 years working like a dog, but if you did not own a piece of ground, you couldn't vote.
The election of 1824 was so crazy that there was no clear winner after the results came in. Jackson received 99 electoral votes, more electoral votes than any other candidate, but he didn't get the majority of electoral votes needed to win the election, which was 131. This means the House of Representatives had to determine the winner out of the top 3 candidates. Well, Henry Clay used his influence as Speaker of the House to convince more people to vote for Adams, not Jackson, and Adams won the election. Well, this really angered Jackson's supporters. After all, Jackson not only received the most electoral votes, but he received the most votes total, with 41.4% of the popular vote, compared to Adams getting just 30.9% of the popular vote. For the next 4 years, Jacksonians, as Jackson's supporters came to be called, planned their revenge. And Jackson's support only grew as he became seen as a victim in the election of 1824. Amazingly, Jackson stayed humble in public, not talking trash about Clay or Adams. Privately, yeah, he was angry too. He hung around in the Senate a bit longer, but abruptly resigned again well before his term was supposed to end. By 1828, Jackson's supporters were calling themselves Democrats, and with the help of a U.S. Senator from New York named Martin Van Buren, they started the Democratic Party.
The Democratic Party was just organizing average people against the rich and powerful. So if Jackson were to somehow reappear and see multiple political parties, he would be confused. Because he would say, there's only 2 groups of folks in this country, us, which are the average folks who are doing the working and the living and dying and so forth in this country. And then there's the wealthy and powerful who are trying to run things and stick it to the little guy. So he would say you only need one.
Like Thomas Jefferson before him, Jackson's supporters viewed Jackson as, quote, one of them, even though by this time Jackson was definitely an aristocrat.
As the folks in the country would say, he never forgot where he came from. And so even though he lived in a house like this, his goal was to represent the people.
Jackson's opponents dug up all the dirt on Jackson. Yeah, it was actually pretty easy for them to do that. So many duels, so many fights, so many temper tantrums. Those 6 soldiers Jackson ordered executed at the end of the War of 1812. Jackson's main opponent was President John Quincy Adams, and they actually agreed on most issues, which is perhaps why both campaigns got so personal. Jackson's campaign ran on symbols, not issues. Adams became seen as the elite insider, Jackson as the populist outsider. Adams' supporters talked trash about how Rachel had still been married when she first got with Andrew. This made Andrew very, very angry, and Rachel very, very stressed. Perhaps related to this, Rachel had a heart attack after Andrew won the election. She did not live to see her husband become president, dying on December 22nd, 1828. Perhaps nothing more negatively affected Jackson in his entire life than the death of his beloved wife. He loved her more than anything. What kept him going after her death? Perhaps it was revenge. At her funeral, he said, quote, "May God Almighty forgive her murderers, as I know she forgave them. I never can." By murderers, he clearly meant Adams' supporters. It's more accurate to say that duty carried Jackson forward after Rachel's death. On March 4th, 4th, 1829, Jacksonians flooded D.C. for his inauguration. They rushed right up to him to shake his hand. Jackson eagerly greeted them. He probably shook around 10,000 hands that day. Before John Quincy Adams and his family and friends could move out, a drunken mob of Jacksonians stormed the White House and damaged thousands of dollars worth of china. It was pure chaos, man. Adams and his crew escaped narrowly out the back door. Loyalty was important to Jackson. After he became president, he felt obligated to give positions of power in his administration to people who had been loyal to him during his campaigns. Referring to Jackson's victory and his appointments of friends to his administration, William Marcy, a U.S. Senator from New York, said, quote, "To the victor belong the spoils." After this, the practice of a political party giving government jobs to its supporters became known as the spoils system, even though the practice had been around long before Jackson. Jackson immediately started investigations into all executive departments to look for corruption. These investigations ultimately found that millions of dollars in today's money was stolen from the Treasury. Strangely, John Calhoun remained as vice president, even though he had previously been the vice president of Jackson's opponent, Adams, and talked trash about him. Jackson and Calhoun got along fine. That is, until the Petticoat Affair and the nullification crisis. The Petticoat Affair was a political scandal in which the wives of most of Jackson's cabinet members and Calhoun's wife all decided to bully Secretary of War John Eaton's wife, Peggy Eaton. It ultimately caused a big rift in Jackson's cabinet. The nullification crisis was a bigger deal, and I even made an entire video about it if you ever want to check that out. Long story short, after South Carolina tried to nullify a tariff, or basically ignore it, Congress freaked out, but ultimately passed a new tariff that South Carolina still wanted to nullify. So Jackson was like, nope, and he sent the military to South Carolina to make sure they paid the gosh darn tariff.
Now Jackson is a Southerner. He is a slave owner, but he was a Unionist. He had fought in the Revolution, and he was not going to dishonor his service, the country, or anybody else's service in the Revolution by giving in to nullification.
By the end of Jackson's first term, spoiler alert, he easily got re-elected president in 1832. Anyway, by the end of Jackson's first term, Calhoun had resigned, and the aforementioned Martin Van Buren took his place as Veep. Oh hey, speaking of 1832, remember that lead bullet that was stuck in his arm? No, not the bullet stuck in his chest. The one from Jesse Benton that shattered his left shoulder. Well, as it turns out, that was what was causing Jackson pain more than anything over the previous 19 years. Go figure. In 1832, Jackson let Thomas Harris, a doctor with the U.S. Navy, finally cut the bullet out. It was an inch below Jackson's skin. Dr. Harris squeezed Jackson's arm and the bullet popped right out. It's worth noting that Jackson didn't get anesthesia for the procedure, although he did apparently drink some alcohol. Jackson may have been popular, but he also had plenty of haters. By the end of his first term, there was an entire movement against him that turned into a new political party, the Whig Party, led by folks like Henry Clay, who by now likely hated Jackson more than any other politician. The two most controversial things Jackson arguably did during his first term was sign the Indian Removal Act and declare war on the Second Bank of the United States, the closest thing resembling a central bank at the time in the country. The Indian Removal Act gave Jackson the power to negotiate treaties to remove American Indians from their land. And that's exactly what Jackson did. By the end of his presidency, Jackson had successfully pushed almost all American Indians to reservations west of the Mississippi to mostly less desirable lands. About 70,000 people, many of them dying on the journey westward due to disease. After the Supreme Court ruled for the Cherokee to stay in Georgia in the case Worcester v. Georgia, Georgia ignored it, and Jackson didn't force Georgia to follow it. Regarding the Second Bank of the United States, well, Jackson viewed it as a tool for the rich.
Using taxpayer money.
Yeah.
And that, to Jackson, was just unconscionable.
He favored a decentralized system that he believed would be more favorable to farmers and small business owners. Throughout most of his second term as president, Jackson led a political struggle today known simply as the Bank War. After Congress voted to reauthorize the bank, Jackson vetoed the bill, and then later removed all the bank's federal deposits, instead having all the money distributed to state banks across the country. The Bank War led to Jackson being the first president in American history to be censured. The Senate censured him on March 28, 1834, for refusing to turn over documents related to the whole ordeal. Regardless, Jackson mostly remained popular, probably because he remained a symbol against the elites and for the common man. In 1835, Jackson became the only president in American history to pay off the national debt. He was against the national debt because, as he viewed it, it tended to favor the rich. Regarding slavery, other than sending federal troops in to end Nat Turner's slave rebellion, Jackson mostly didn't bring up slavery much, knowing it was such a divisive issue in the country. The Jackson administration was successful at establishing several trade agreements with countries around the world. Jackson appointed 5 Supreme Court justices to the Supreme Court throughout his tenure. Most were not elite types, of course. Jackson almost certainly would have been elected for a 3rd term, but instead, keeping with the 2-term tradition, announced his retirement, endorsing his Veep, Martin Van Buren, to take his place. Thanks to Jackson's popularity, Van Buren fairly easily won the election of 1836. On the last day of his presidency, Jackson recognized the Republic of Texas. He later called for its annexation. After he left the presidency, Jackson retired here to the Hermitage. Most of the last years of his life were during a major economic depression caused by the Panic of 1837, which most historians say Jackson himself caused due to the Bank War. That depression certainly hurt his reputation, and the Whigs would gain power in the coming years. Still, Jackson stayed politically influential and outspoken until his final days. Speaking of his final days, most of the photographs you see of him are from that time. Only like 3 photos of him exist. He spent much of his final days with his family. He had survived so much crazy stuff throughout his entire life, but his heart ultimately failed him on June 8th, 1845. He was 78. While Andrew Jackson was, and still is, a polarizing president in American history, he undoubtedly left a lasting impact on the United States. He was the first president born in poverty, the first born west of the Appalachian Mountains. He expanded democracy.
Jackson redefined what democracy meant. In fact, in most history textbooks, high school and college, he's really the only president who's had an era named after him, because you'll find a chapter, The Age of Jacksonian Democracy. That impacted the most people long term.
His rise to power led to the development of 2 brand new political parties. Jackson also strengthened the office of the presidency.
From being a, I won't say exclusively, but largely ceremonial office in a way, to being that of an active chief executive.
Heck, in some ways, he even preserved the Union.
I like the statement that's in our museum. Jackson says, "I was born for a storm, and a calm does not suit me," which is an excellent self-evaluation. Of course, what he doesn't say, when he says, "I'm born for a storm," he caused several of those storms himself. Others he didn't back down from. Jackson would not back down.
Known for his fiery personality and for being the first president to represent the common man, he single-handedly changed American politics forever. For better or for worse? Nah, actually I'd say mostly for better. Sometimes we need outsiders in there to shake things up and stick it to the elites. And Jackson indeed was a champion for the underdog. Well, the white underdogs. Hey, it was still progress. And folks forget that Jackson, even though he was one of the elites by the time he ran for president, truly was a rags to riches story. He was born in poverty and rose up. The first president to represent the so-called American dream. Jackson never forgot his humble upbringing, and his populist message and commanding leadership style helped shape the American democratic ideals that many of us take for granted today. That all said, critics called him a demagogue who ignored the law when it was convenient. Sure, he was terrifying and racist and a little crazy, but I think that the United States ultimately ended up on a better path because of him.
It's the second oldest presidential museum operation. Tour started in 1889. This is as close to time travel as it gets. But you open the doors, you're stepping into 1837 to 1845. 84% plus of the furnishings in this house are original to the Jackson family.
Wow.
It doesn't get any better than this.
A shout out to Ann McClane and Keith Hardison and everyone else here at the Hermitage just outside of Nashville, Tennessee for their help making this video. Also a shout out to my daughters and wife for helping film. And if you ever get a chance to visit this place, I highly recommend it. Which president should I cover next for this series? Let me know your opinion on the internet.
So is that enough for you?
Yeah,
give you
good. Thank you so much.